From the studios of Clean Fuels Alliance America, this is the Better, Cleaner, Now podcast. Fascinating ideas and conversations in the world of biodiesel, renewable diesel, and sustainable aviation fuel. Now, here's your host, Scott Tremaine.
And welcome. Today, Clean Fuels CEO Donnell Rehagen is joined by the CEO of Kennedy Consulting, Wayne Kennedy, to discuss the history of the United States rail industry and their move to decarbonization through the use of biodiesel and renewable diesel.
Well, hey, thanks, Scott and Wayne. It's certainly great to have you with us this week, and I'm excited to talk about what I think is one of the more exciting industries that are beginning to see the benefits of our fuels. And so, Wayne, you've been working with us in a consulting role, working with us here at Clean Fuels for about a year and a half now, helping us really dive in and understand this railroad industry. And it's a really intriguing industry when you think about its role in the United States. But maybe first, why don't I let you let our listeners in on a little bit about Wayne Kennedy, where you've been, what you've done, kind of your role in the railroads, and then we'll pick it up from there.
Thanks, Donnell. Good to be with you today. In terms of my association with rail, I've been in the transportation industry ever since graduating with a mechanical engineering degree. It's been a little over 30 years, and I started working for a transportation company that built and designed freight locomotives. At the time, it was called GE Transportation Systems.
Oh, yeah.
They were purchased by Wabtec about 5 years ago.
Yeah.
And that eventually got me to Union Pacific Railroad, one of the Western railroads within the U.S., and I had the pleasure of forming a fuel conservation group for Union Pacific, and worked with them for almost 20 years, saved a lot of fuel, and then became a private consultant, and I work predominantly in the fuel conservation space, and of course, biofuels is a big part of reducing greenhouse gas emissions, so a very big play for railroads to participate in that manner.
Well, you said something that's very interesting. You said Western railroads. And so, that tells me that the railroads, and there's a number of them, so maybe you can help us understand who they are, but they've kind of positioned geographically to kind of cover the United States. Talk a little bit about these class ones that probably more people are familiar with, and kind of how that makeup of services is done and covered here across the United States.
Absolutely. Yeah, there's 6 Class 1 railroads within North America, predominantly the U.S. and Canada, and some of them reach down into Mexico as well. So there are predominantly 2 Western U.S. railroads, Union Pacific, UP, and Burlington Northern Santa Fe, BNSF, and then the 2 Eastern U.S. railroads, CSX, and Norfolk Southern, or NS. And then up in Canada, we have Canadian National, CN, and a fairly recently merged railroad, CPKC, that's short for Canadian Pacific, and Kansas City, and that was a merger between CP and KCS that goes down to Mexico. So that's kind of the first railroad merger that allowed, full reach from the northern parts of Canada all the way down through the U.S. and into Mexico. So kind of a very exciting opportunity for the rail industry, particularly for that railroad to serve those 3 countries end to end, one railroad. I think the industry is very, very excited at that opportunity.
I think a lot of us as Americans, I know speaking for myself anyway, don't think a lot about railroads. I mean, we're driving down the interstates maybe, and we see the railroad tracks over to the right or left side of the road, or we may see them through the river bottoms, here in the Midwest. And but the railroad industry in the United States has a huge history. I mean, when you start thinking about how old railroad transportation is and kind of why it was originally created, I'm assuming with your tenure in the railroad industry, you're somewhat of a historian of the railroads. Can you tell us a little bit kind of about what and how things got started and how we got to where we are today with these with the rail transportation?
Absolutely. And you are correct. Railroads are kind of the unsung hero of transportation.
Yeah.
They haul on a gross ton mile basis 40% of all freight that's hauled within at least the U.S.
Oh, wow.
And they only contribute a very measly 1.7% of the greenhouse gas emissions for all transportation. So a very fuel efficient manner of hauling freight. In terms of history, the rails have been around almost as long as the country's been in existence. The Transcontinental Railway was underway, or a goal, by President Lincoln. And shortly after the end of the Civil War, two railroads were working hard to meet. Promontory, Utah happened to be that golden spike, final spike to meet those two railroads, one heading east, the other heading west. And 140,000 miles of railroad track within North America, probably within North America even a little higher. I think the U.S. is about 140,000 miles. Within North America, it's probably touching 160,000 miles of track. You've got roughly 30,000, approaching 30,000 locomotives that serve that industry. And, railroads fall into different classifications. It's all driven by their annual revenue. You've got the big boys, the 6 Class 1s. Their annual revenue, if it's something a little over $1 billion, then they are designated as a Class 1. The smaller Class 2s are consortiums of the Class 3s that are small short line and industry railroads. All told, there's over 600 Class 3s, over 20 Class 2s, and then again the 6 large Class 1s. The Class 1s are really behemoths in terms of size. The rail industry burns about 3.5 billion gallons of diesel fuel a year.
Oh, wow. And
the Class 1s are easily well over 90% of that total.
Well, this long history, when you think back to some of the early settlers and the presidents and the expansion of the country, rail would have been the way everything moved. Today it mostly moves goods. There's still, of course, people get moved in on rail as well. But back then it was probably everything in the kitchen sink moving back and forth on rails if it was going to go very far.
Right. And rail is definitely the mode of choice, transportation mode of choice for long distances. And they're certainly trying very hard to be competitive with truck. The trucking industry is kind of the transportation mode that rail looks at as an opportunity to gain market share. And they're trying, obviously, to offer truck-like service and to attract more business from the trucking industry, even for some of these, shorter hauls that would be classified as under 500 miles. Providing truck-like service is the goal, and then they certainly hope to be able to attract, transition those heavy-duty 18-wheelers, off of the highways and onto the rail, where it's easily 3 to 4 times more fuel efficient to transport a ton of revenue product via rail compared to truck. Railroads, interestingly, the statistics that are used on a revenue ton mile, you can haul a ton of goods almost 500 miles on 1 gallon of diesel, which is really amazing.
Yeah.
If you look at a gross ton, including the weight of the rail cars themselves, then that ton can travel almost 1,000 miles on one gallon of fuel. So really a very, very efficient way of moving freight. That steel wheel on the steel rail is very, very efficient.
So when I see trains, as I travel and see trains, the one thing I always think about, some trains are short, some are really, 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 really long. How does the logistics of all that come together that makes a determination about the length of a train?
A lot of it deals with the commodity that's being hauled.
Okay.
So, railroads, they call them by different names, but, from a layman's perspective, you've got bulk traffic, which is the same commodity, whether it be coal or grain, perhaps potash, to some extent finished vehicles. Those are in unit trains where every car on the train is hauling the same stuff. And then another big classification is intermodal trains. They predominantly run as unit trains, and those are the large 40 or 53-foot box containers that also are hauled on ships and also are hauled on over-the-road trucks. So thus the name intermodal, where there are multiple modal transportation types that go into moving goods not only across the country but across the world. And then the third general category is merchandise traffic that are all sorts of different car types. You'd have box cars, you'd have individual grain cars. Maybe they're not hauling grain, maybe they're hauling plastic pellets. Lots of different specialty cars,
Tank cars.
Tank cars, definitely. I mean, railroads haul, wind blades, those huge propellers that go into those large wind generators. So lots of specialty cars, power generation equipment. So there's almost everything that you or I use on a daily basis has been hauled at some point in its life by the rail industry, getting to or from, or once it's a finished product, getting to the store shelf.
Well, it's really intriguing you talked about these intermodal. I'm going to guess that's a more recent years development within the rail industry, but I've used that conversation when I talk about the importance of decarbonization globally. When I mention to people about how all the goods that we order online, from Amazon, and it shows up at our door, in a couple of days. It didn't show up there magically. I mean, a lot of what we order comes from overseas, so it starts on a vessel. Those vessels use diesel fuel. It comes to the United States. It, gets offloaded at a port. Maybe it hits rail right there and goes to a more central location, a warehouse. Rail, of course, uses diesel fuel. And then maybe it gets transported out from there by truck to another warehouse, and then ultimately a last mile vehicle that drops it at our doorstep. Almost all, if not all, using diesel fuel. So the intermodal is a really interesting development where you're able to just take the boxes literally off of the ship and drop them onto a train car, and they're basically ready to go to wherever their next destination is.
Correct. Yeah, a very efficient way of moving goods worldwide.
Yeah. Well, let's get into a little bit of, we're here in the clean fuel space. And so you mentioned earlier about the volume of fuel, 3.5 billion gallons. I mean, that is a lot of diesel fuel. And you talked about the efficiency, and one of your roles when you were, at Union Pacific was to try to help reduce the fuel use. And do I assume that fuel consumption and the cost of fuel is a top 3 cost to a railroad?
It's typically number 2, and that's after paying for their wonderful employees. So it's always the most expensive individual product that they purchase.
So even more expensive than these massive locomotives that they talk about. So
correct,
to move those goods. So let's talk about those fuels. When you talk about diesel fuel and you talk about railroads, how does the railroad industry fuel? I mean, do they generally get their fuel to central locations, I'm assuming, each administered by their individual railroads, so they all own their own, I'll call them fueling locations. They have jobbers that bring bulk fuel to those locations, and then they fuel at various spots. I mean, am I getting close?
Correct, yeah. The large class ones, depending upon the size of the railroad, to give you kind of a sense of scale, the 2 Western U.S. railroads, UP and BNSF, they burning approximately 900 million for UP, about 1.1 billion gallons a year for the BNSF. And then the other 4 class ones, they're all in about the 400 million gallon per year range, give or take 5% or so, but they're all kind of in that range. And predominantly, diesel fuel is delivered by pipeline. There are smaller locations, of course, where delivered by truck. All railroads have numerous storage tanks, relatively small, a couple 100,000 gallons to very large, measured in millions of gallons. North Platte as a yard, as an example for Union Pacific, one of the largest classification yards probably in the entire world. I think it's approaching 3,000 acres and about 6 miles wide at its widest point. So millions of gallons of diesel fuel are dispensed there, on a regular basis. And fueling is the lifeblood of the railroad. They have to have a ready supply of fuel that's high quality. And there at the right time, if a railroad was to run out of fuel at any given location, it would be very, very damaging to the railroads simply because they got to move freight. And it's a very interconnected system. So if they're not moving trains because they've run out of fuel at a certain location, that's going to cascade throughout their entire system very quickly. So it rarely, if ever, happens, but railroads depend on that fuel supply. That's basically their lifeblood of moving freight.
So that's where the pipeline, which I wasn't aware of that's where the pipeline supply comes into place. So are those pipelines that supply those rail yards, are those owned by the railroads or are they owned by the pipelines?
Pipelines themselves, correct.
Okay. So there's a very strong partnership between railroads and fuel suppliers that own the pipelines to move the right amount of fuel at the right time to keep those trains on the tracks and running, not sitting idle by.
Correct. Yep.
No money to be made from an idle train, right? Especially one that might be running, right?
That is the absolute worst thing to happen to any railroad, is to run out of fuel, either not have fuel to fuel an empty locomotive, but also to run out of fuel. That's a big, big deal. It happens very, very seldom, thankfully.
This is the Better, Cleaner, Now podcast. Fascinating ideas and conversations in the world of biodiesel, renewable diesel, and sustainable aviation fuel.
I'm Donnell Rehagen, and we're speaking today with Wayne Kennedy. So, Wayne, we were just talking a little bit about the fuel and how rail yards get supplied with the fuel that they're using. And it is a massive amount of diesel fuel, and we hope that to be biodiesel and renewable diesel in the near term. So let's talk a little bit about what's happening in that transitional space. We know railroads are much like every other mode of transportation. There's pressure on them and encouragement of them to help with the decarbonization efforts that are going on globally. So tell our listeners maybe a little bit about what you know to be going on among those, especially the Class 1 railroads and their efforts to decarbonize.
Excellent question. Probably about 5 years ago, maybe a little more, the Class 1s began signing up for science-based target initiatives, and that is a opportunity to have their greenhouse gas emissions goals to be properly vetted and to be announced and disclosed to the world. And all of the Class 1s, all of the 6 Class 1s have signed up for, what I consider very aggressive goals, anywhere from 30 to 50%, reduction out to generally the 2030 time frame from a baseline of, approximately 2018. Different railroads had different baseline years. But to put that in perspective, the rail industry overall, they have increased or improved their fuel efficiency approximately 1% per year going back numerous decades. And that is, through purchasing newer, more fuel-efficient locomotives, through changing the way they operate and power their trains, through employee training, obviously through technology. They've garnered about that roughly 1% improvement in fuel efficiency going back 20, 30 years. Now to say, jump forward to 2030, we're about halfway there from the 2018 baseline, and to have that 30 to 50% reduction goal, that's a difficult putt.
Pretty massive.
Yeah. So it's interesting to see how they've reacted. They've definitely looking very solidly at significantly increasing their uptake, their usage of biodiesel, and in some cases renewable diesel as well, depending upon the location of the country that they're operating. So obviously I watch the industry very, very closely. I did as an employee historically. I have the last 6 years as a private consultant. And the rail industry is definitely, biofuels has their complete and total attention because it is a much more elegant solution to GHG emissions reduction compared to having to invest in completely, new locomotives, whether it's hydrogen fuel cell locomotives, whether it's battery electric locomotives. That technology is in its infancy and it's being developed, and it's not going to be ready anytime near those 2030 near-term goals for those GHG emissions reduction.
Well, Wayne, if I remember right, you said earlier there's like 30,000 of these locomotives in the railroad industry. And if that's the case, I'm assuming that those don't turn over that fast. Those locomotives would appear to me to be probably multi-million-dollar pieces of equipment. So railroads probably rely on those to have a fairly extensive life cycle. And so therefore, if you think about where the railroads are trying to really make a decarbonization hit in the next, let's just say 10 years, it's not going to be made by turning over their fleet. That's just not going to be possible.
Absolutely true. Yeah, there are many locomotives currently in service, and they get cascaded down, from a Class 1 to a Class 2 to a Class 3. But there are many locomotives that are 50 years or older that the Class 2s and 3s are operating. So absolutely correct. It's not like the trucking industry where the asset gets turned relatively quickly, 3 to 5 years probably within the trucking industry. For railroads with locomotives, you're talking 10 times that long. So nothing happens quickly there.
So relying on liquid fuels now, or historically in the form of diesel, I mean, that's where their target would naturally seem like it is going to be, is in what can they do with cleaner liquid fuels in the near term as the industry figures out what it's going to be eventually from a clean transportation perspective.
Correct. And, I pour through individual railroad sustainability reports. They get released generally on an annualized basis. And I've been able to kind of track, the increase in uptake in terms of the blend of biofuels. There's two kind of clear leaders in the Western U.S. Union Pacific is a clear leader. They were over 6% last year. And then in Canada, Canadian National is a leader with over a 4% blend of biofuels. The other four are somewhat playing catch up, somewhat kind of looking to see what the industry's doing, but they're all increasing the amount of blend that they're purchasing on a year-over-year basis.
Well, we definitely know the attention of the railroads has been tuned up. In fact, you mentioned Union Pacific, but also CPKC have both recently become members of our organization, and they're the first of the railroads to do so. So we know that they're interested in where our industry is going. Obviously, we've had a long history with the railroads, our industry has. They have moved commodities and goods, feedstocks into our production plants, biodiesel and renewable diesel, and they've also moved finished products out. They continue to do that today. So Not only have we relied on them to help us produce our products and distribute our products, but now hopefully they'll be able to rely on us to help provide cleaner transportation for them.
Absolutely true. Make no mistake that the rails look at biofuels and this industry as a growth market for them. When you listen into quarterly earnings reports, other financial reports that happen on a fairly regular basis throughout the year, they talk about this as a growth industry and something that they're looking forward to serving on both ends, both the bringing in feedstock, transporting feedstock, finished product, and then, of course, being an end user as well.
Well, they've been great partners for a long time, and we've really relied on them. As you know, our fuels, for the most part, do not move on the pipeline. And so being produced, especially biodiesel, at smaller plants in the Midwest and needing to get to customers maybe on both coasts, rail's always been kind of the go-to. And so I'm glad, like I said, to kind of see that relationship come full circle with us being able to start supplying some of the fuels that can help them meet their goals as well.
Very true. It's a good partnership and one that I'm sure will continue to grow and develop.
Well, in this tight time frame that they're looking at, I mean, I don't know if they sort of got started later than they wish they would have, but those are some extremely aggressive goals for a very, very short time frame. I mean, we've seen some longer term decarbonization goals. For instance, California and their LCFS was originally a 20% carbon reduction over a 20 plus year time frame. I mean, the railroads are looking at trying to make a huge impact in under a decade.
Very true. I mean, Union Pacific is on record as indicating that they want to be at a B10 blend by the end of next year, 2025. They want to be at a B20, and this is kind of a floor. They want to be at a B20 by 2030. And a number of other Class 1s have also kind of stated that, we want roughly half of our GHG emissions reduction performance to come from the use of higher blends of biofuels, in the B20 to B30 range. So that's all the way that it should be moving forward.
Well, you mentioned earlier hydrogen fuel cells and that there are some other alternatives, maybe longer term, but what's happening with electrification and batteries? I mean, I do hear that there are battery-powered locomotives. I mean, are those in some limited applications, or is there anticipation that we could see a wider use of those in the near to mid to long term even?
The technology is progressing. It's definitely still in its infancy phase. So there's probably, maybe a dozen prototypes that are running around. They're typically in what we call yard service. So these are much shorter runs. They have the ability, at least for the battery electrics, we call them BELs for short, to be able to be charged on a fairly regular basis. And obviously that takes several hours just because of the size and energy density of the battery itself. So there are opportunities there. Freight is generally divided into two main camps. You've got your yard and local service, which are very short hops. And that obviously lends itself well to both BEL and to some extent hydrogen fuel cells. And then you have, your long haul going across the wide open expanses. That's kind of mainline freight where, your locomotives pulling freight hour after hour, day after day. It stops to refuel, it stops to change crews, but that's about it. And a battery electric locomotive is just not going to cut it for that type of service because the energy density simply is not there compared to what they have currently with liquid diesel fuel on board. So the technology needs to mature to get to that point. Other aspects of electrification, overhead catenary, that's going to also take time to mature simply because of the cost of the infrastructure to have that happen, out in the middle of states in the Intermountain West, Wyoming, a lot of wide open space, not a lot of infrastructure to make that happen easily.
So do those BELs, as you referred to them, that are in place today, do they have the ability to move the same amount of weight as a diesel-powered locomotive? So does it just take more of them, or how does that? How do they compare, I guess?
It definitely takes more of them just because of the energy density difference. And nobody wants to put 20 locomotives on a freight train.
Okay. Yeah.
Going across the country. They'd much prefer to have 2 or 3 burning diesel fuel. So again, the technology is maturing in terms of the energy density, how much you're able to pack into a locomotive. That has continued to increase. It started out relatively low. It's probably doubled or tripled within the past 5 years. It'll need to do that a couple of times over to get to the same energy density that you've got with liquid diesel fuels currently.
So typically today, then, sounds like you're going to see these BELs moving train cars around yards and maybe short runs.
Correct.
But really, the majority of the movements and the shipments in the rail industry they're not going to be suitable for that, at least at the current time.
Not in the near term. Yeah, we're talking a decade or two out before or longer. It just depends. Interestingly, again, from a historical standpoint, when the industry moved from steam locomotives to the existing diesel electric locomotives, that was a process some refer to as dieselization. That took about 30 years.
Now, when did that start?
That was probably in the 1940s.
Okay.
Right. And about 30 years to get, fully implemented and fully deployed across the entire industry. And the interesting thing about the comparison there with what then and now is moving from steam to diesel electric was much more energy efficient, much more cost efficient. Everything was going the right direction for the rail industry. So it was kind of a no-brainer to go that direction. Currently, diesel fuel, a very, very efficient form of energy storage and utilization. Going from what we have now with diesel electrics to the technologies of the future, hydrogen fuel cells, battery electric, you don't have those same efficiencies of scale. You're needing to invest large amounts of money in infrastructure, in fuel handling. So, the rails understand that long term it will cost them more, and that likely will take longer than the process of dieselization, where everything was going the right direction in terms of cost efficiencies. This transition, they don't have that luxury, at least currently. That certainly could change in the future.
Well, our industry is extremely pleased to be able to be part of that solution they're looking for to try to help them with that decarbonization. It's going to be, as you mentioned, it's going to be a long-term effort to kind of transform the whole rail industry into new technology. And quite frankly, they don't need to do that, right? We're here to help, and we're looking forward to continuing to build that relationship with them. And I'm very excited to have had you join our team and to have you here. You've shared a lot with our listeners today, and I've learned a lot on this as well. And so I appreciate you again. Appreciate you taking the time to join us on the podcast, Wayne.
Thank you, Donnell. It's been a pleasure. I've enjoyed it very much.
All right, great conversation. And that's it for this week's episode. Hey, if you've got a second and you haven't done it already, please consider giving us a rating. It really does help our show grow. And if you really want to go for it, just leave us a review, like this one from Black Eyed Bees, who writes, I just discovered this podcast and learned so much from the first few episodes. I can't wait to listen to the rest. The information can get pretty technical, but it is always educational and informative. I highly recommend it. Well, thank you, Black Eyed Bees. And if you leave us a review, we might just read it here too. So please do that wherever you get your podcasts. And if you have a question for our experts or a suggestion for future topics or guests, you can email us at podcasts@cleanfuels.org. And join us next week for another episode of the Better, Cleaner Now podcast.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe on your favorite podcast platform. To catch all the latest from Clean Fuels Alliance America, follow us at cleanfuels.org. The Better, Cleaner Now podcast is a production of Clean Fuels Alliance America. That's all for us. Now it's your turn to be better, cleaner now.